Okay, welcome everybody. This is, my name's Alan Levin, and this is part of a series I call Crossing Boundaries Interviews, where I have conversations with people who have themselves crossed some boundaries, psychologically, culturally, spiritually, religiously, politically, and are in one way or another working to make the world a better place, often by helping other people to expand their sense of boundary and what limits their thinking or who they define as allies or part of their reality. So which brings me to my guest today is Ciaran O'Connor, who is leads the marketing, digital, and communication strategy for Braver Angels. Before joining Braver Angels in June of 2017, Ciaran served as a staffer on the 2012 Obama campaign and the 2016 Clinton campaign. And he worked as a political consultant at Precision Strategies. He's a native New Yorker, and Ciaran holds a BA in public policy from Duke University. So I have previously given a talk about Braver Angels a while back. I have it on my YouTube channel, and I've written about it. And in full disclosure, I am a member and a supporter of Braver Angels. And to be honest, I sometimes have a hard time with what comes through from Braver Angels. So one part of what has kept me in the fold has been to listen to and watch Ciaran speak and be on panels where he seems to be able to hold clearly a progressive political perspective, speak from that place, and yet treat people with great respect, a good listener, and honors different points of view without rancor. So, or any kind of personal attack, which is what Braver Angels teaches. And so he's a great model for it. And I learn a lot from listening to him and watching what he does. So Ciaran, let's go back a bit in your own personal life. Can you say something about just in your childhood when you were growing up in your family? What was that like? And in particular, do you see it as anything formative in terms of your politics, your view of the larger world and what your relationship is to it?
Sure. Well, first, I'd just like to say thank you for having me on the show. It's nice to be able to be a guest on a podcast as well as a host. So I always appreciate that opportunity. In terms of my own upbringing, I was born and raised in New York City. My father comes from a Catholic family. My mother comes from a Jewish family. They are both journalists who, I think it's fair to say, lean liberal politically. And growing up in New York City, I think that I always saw myself as someone who delighted in and valued diversity, taking the subway to school every day, being surrounded by people of all colors, backgrounds, walks of life, socioeconomic station, etc. And it wasn't until I went to college and until I started working in politics that I discovered that this diversity that I valued did not always include political diversity. The vast majority of my friends, my peers, my network tended to be Democrats, liberals, blues, as we might call them in Braver Angels. And it wasn't really until I started working with then Better Angels, now Braver Angels, soon after its inception in 2017, that I truly started forming deep relationships with people who I admired and respected a great deal, but who held worldviews and looked at core issues that undergird our ideology and identity in fundamentally different ways than I did. And
Ciaran, let me interrupt you just for a minute and just ask you to stay for a minute with going back. So when you were a child, your parents were liberals. Was politics discussed a lot? Were you kind of immersed in a world where people talked about intellectual ideas and what's going on in the world and who the good guys were and who the bad guys were?
Yes, definitely. My father in particular has always been politically active and vocal in his beliefs. He's a writer and a journalist, and I remember as a kid, the New York Times was always on the kitchen room table. So I was pretty well tuned into current events, but through a specific prism, through the prism of the New York Times and my parents' politics and their network, which was very much, a certain kind of liberal New York City view of the world. And as you mentioned, the heroes and villains in the narratives that we tell each other about power and the proceedings of the world. And I came of age in the Bush years. So I remember vividly the 2000 election. I guess I was 9 years old, soon to turn 10, when the election happened in 2000, the controversy over who was the rightful winner, the hanging chads in Florida. And I remember following closely along and, rooting for Al Gore to emerge victorious, and feeling a sense of disappointment and anger and frustration and confusion over why George W. Bush had won, when Republicans to me at that time were fairly alien, even though I knew people who were Republicans. George W. Bush was sort of seen as kind of a cartoon almost. And it was sort of a realization when George W. Bush, that when he won, that the United States was a much broader and different in some ways country than the bubble in which I lived. And then September 11th happened. I was in Manhattan for 9/11. So I think that was a pretty seminal moment in terms of my political awareness and my awareness of how foreign actors and the US government all had roles to play in dictating events that would affect all of our daily lives. And further came of age in the Bush years. I remember being very opposed to the war in Iraq, protesting with friends and family, and then coming to be very inspired by Barack Obama. I remember volunteering on his campaign in 2008 and very much buying into the vision that he cast as a candidate, which was very much aligned with the messages that we seek to purvey at Braver Angels in terms of transcending division to pursue our higher ideals. And that was the essence of his famous convention speech. And I think that messaging was peppered into his speeches throughout his time in office.
Yeah. Yeah, even though, of course, he's he's accused by people on the other side of being a great polarizer.
Right.
In a strange sort of way, isn't it? But coming back again to your family, though, just one more thing. I'm guessing at least that your father was Irish. And it's often interesting how ethnicity and ancestral lineage plays a role in one's thinking and consciousness and politics. Was Ireland and the issues of Ireland big in your family, or?
To some extent, my father was raised in a working class Irish Catholic community, but he rejected Catholicism in a fairly wholesale manner, leaving the house at 16. And so I think that he always harbored a suspicion of organized religion or dominant authority. And so I think that expressed itself in his work and his politics, and was probably passed down to me as well. And I as we discussed before this podcast, I just did a conversation with a woman who leads a libertarian conference called Freedom Fest happening this week. And there's interesting overlap between certain strands of libertarianism and liberalism and leftism in terms of a suspicion of authority and wanting to be left alone by powers of government that might seek to oppress, be that the government or corporate structures. And so I think there was sort of that initial questioning of authority and protecting oneself from powerful interests that might seek to abuse one to maintain their power and privilege and position in society. I don't know how much that has to do necessarily with his upbringing, but I imagine that maybe the rejection of Catholicism was instrumental in some way.
Sounds like he was a boundary crosser in that sense.
Yes, you know, absolutely.
Definitely when somebody leaves the fold of their parental religious orientation, can be a big one. In college, is that when you became more involved with politics, more involved with any kind of activism?
Yes, in college, I spent time as a journalist writing about politics and interviewing leading political figures who came to campus. I think at the time I was still very much coming at my coverage from a pretty partisan lens. I mean, when you grow up swimming in certain waters and you're young, there's a certain sense of confidence and self-righteousness that the way you see the world is the rational, right, just way of seeing the world. And I remember I did a series of interviews with leading conservative figures, John Bolton, for example, Douglas Feith, who was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy under George W. Bush and one of the key architects of the war in Iraq. I had interviews with them. But looking back, I think that my interviews were more about trying to press them on, say, the most controversial things they had said, or ask them to defend their positions from various criticisms, which I do think is an important role of a reporter, to shine light on truth, speak truth to power. But it's interesting to contrast that now with the conversations that I facilitate and that Braver Angels facilitates, which are about just getting at the truth in the moment, speaking your truth and trying to understand someone else's truth and speaking your opinion, but coming at the conversation with less of an agenda where you're trying to use the conversation as evidence that you're right and the other person is wrong. And so in college, I definitely remember being more in that place. And then I worked on the Obama campaign in 2012, kind of my first real job. And that was very much a battle, you know, it's win or lose. And there's a reason that people use so many war metaphors in politics. And so we were the good guys and Mitt Romney and the Republicans were the bad guys. And we had to do what we had to do to try to get reelected. And that meant, you know, defending the president's record. It meant fact checking Mitt Romney. But it also meant the sort of messaging of campaigns, which is to try to take what someone said and use it as evidence to support your narrative. And I think when it comes to politics and political campaigns, the goal is not depolarization, the goal is winning. And that was very much the lens through which I was first introduced to political engagement, was sort of as a soldier, as it were, in you know, the great battle we have in this country every 4 years when it comes to who's going to be the president.
Yeah, I pick up maybe a note of regret or remorse at the earlier partisan warrior that you were, and how the commitment to depolarizing now was like a big shift for you.
Yeah, I don't know if it's regret necessarily, because I'm proud of the work that I did, and elections have consequences. And sometimes I think, you know, in 2012, we ran the campaign that we needed to run to win. I think in retrospect, when you think about a guy like Mitt Romney, a lot of Democrats now would, you know, maybe point to him as one of the few honorable Republicans that they might begrudgingly respect. Whereas at the time, you know, Mitt Romney was this evil vulture capitalist who hated women and wanted to take us back to the 1950s. And of course, Romney had to say all sorts of things to win the Republican primary, some of which were quite extreme. And so I don't know if it's regret. It's just sort of looking back on a separate time and sort of noting that the dynamics and forces that were underway then would just accelerate so much. The notion that the ends justify the means, people have that view always, but they put limits on it, right? So they say, okay, the ends justify the means, but there are limits to what we won't do, right? Like maybe we will exaggerate or take out of context or sort of stitch together a narrative based on disparate elements, but you know, we'll never outright lie. We'll never say something that we know to be false. And over the course of time, those limits just kept getting pushed outwards. And I think it was fairly asymmetrical during the Obama presidency. I think maybe partially that was due to the fact that Obama was in power. And I think it's partially due to the fact that Republicans knew that tearing down Obama was their path to retaining power. And so I think it's just interesting to think about how those dynamics were already happening. And we've obviously seen the degree to which they've intensified, where the limits are not even there anymore. I mean, even violence is excused, tolerated, or even sometimes encouraged.
In one of your interviews that I saw you do, you talked about the loss that we all felt deeply when Hillary lost the election to Trump, and that it really threw you. It put you into a real time of self-reflection and reckoning, and you went to Asia. Can you talk a little bit about that, like what that experience was like for you, and where did you go and what happened out there?
Sure. Well, it's interesting because I had originally planned to go to Hong Kong for a week after the election for what was intended to be a post-victory celebration vacation, to be followed by a triumphant return to the United States, perhaps to work in the government or to work as part of the new power that we had maintained for the Democrats following the election of the first Black president, with the first female president, securing the march toward progress. Obviously, that's not what happened. And there's another discussion to be had about the who, what, when, where, why, how, what went wrong, what could have been done differently. But it's funny because even on election night, as soon as it became clear to me that we were going to lose, I sort of immediately knew that I was going to stay in Asia for longer than a week. Partially that was due to the fact that, I was going to be unemployed, and sort of at a time in my life where I didn't have any upcoming obligations, and also, wanting to reset and just get away from this country that had, to me, somehow revealed itself as different from what I thought it was. My conception of my country seemed shaken, and so part of it was escapism, and part of it was also a desire to kind of seize this opportunity that I wouldn't always have to be able to travel and explore new cultures in sort of a open-ended fashion. And so I ended up traveling throughout the continent for about 2.5 months, starting in Hong Kong, then Japan, then China, then Myanmar, and then Thailand, before coming home. And it was a amazing experience just to be in this whole eastern part of the world that I'd never been to before, with such different, vibrant cultures, different approaches to living and eating and thinking about the world and our relationship to other humans and the natural world. And so I'm very grateful that I was able to do that. And it was sort of a nice cushion to the loss. And then I came back to New York and watched President Trump get inaugurated.
Before you come back, what were some of the insights that you had about the East and life there, and the way people are, the way they were?
Well, I did a 10-day silent meditation retreat in Yangon. It was a Vipassana retreat.
Oh.
And it was kind of a spur of the moment decision. I met this guy in Hong Kong and I told him I was on this open-ended journey. And he said that he said, have you ever done a meditation retreat before? I said, no, I'd really hardly even meditated, but I figured, when in Asia, and so I sort of jumped off the deep end, and I did this retreat, which was pretty intense, meditating for hours a day, in silence.
This was in Japan?
This was in Yangon, the capital of Myanmar. And the discipline of meditation, Vipassana, at least this specific kind, was popularized by Indian American who grew up in then Burma, named S.N. Goenka, who developed this method of meditation and mindfulness, which is very much focused on using the breath to become more present and to be able to observe with more clarity and less reactivity the thoughts and feelings and emotions that we have, that we normally would react to with craving or aversion, to be able to observe those sensations with more equanimity and the power and clarity and sense of well-being that can grant. And so I felt like I just got a taste of that, but it was, incredibly difficult to sit in silence for that long.
Yeah. Did you follow up? Have you continued to practice meditation? And
haltingly, I have. I go in phases where I will meditate regularly and then I will fall out of the practice. And I normally, when I am meditating regularly, I can feel the benefits. And it's like everything else. You have to get back into practice. It's like playing soccer. You still kind of know how to play, but you have to get back in fitness. You have to get back in form. It's the same with meditation. But I think doing the retreat sort of reminds me that there's always that, burning ember somewhere deep in there that could be, rekindled with the right care and attention.
Yeah. I'm sure it must be helpful to you in your work with Braver Angels.
Yeah, I mean, the work can be quite exhausting and frustrating and depressing because the forces that we're up against are so powerful and seem to be winning if you think about it as a struggle. So I think meditating does help to try to observe those feelings without being as controlled by them as one could be.
Yeah, I'm glad you shared that. And you seem to have really come to a fairly clear understanding of what meditation can do and is, the way you describe it.
And it's interesting because I think it's fairly easy comparatively to intellectually understand that, but the real impact is experientially. There's really no, so you can't sort of just read the theories, the moral and ethical frameworks that undergird the practice. It's not really the same. And so
it's experiential.
Yeah.
So when you came back, that's somewhere in there you encountered Braver Angels. And
yes.
Did Braver Angels immediately make sense to you, or was it was it something that you really had to transition into?
Yeah, well, at that time, it was Better Angels, and it was very much fledgling. It was essentially a workshop model that had been developed by Bill Doherty, who is one of the co-founders, and piloted at 2 initial workshops in southwestern Ohio that were organized by one of the other co-founders, David Lapp, who lives there and is enmeshed in that community, and executed to great success. And also, one of the workshops was filmed as part of a documentary that was funded by Peter Yarrow of Peter, Paul, and Mary.
This was a workshop
and so
together Republicans and Democrats, or Reds and Blues.
Yes, the initial Red Blue workshop. And so when I found out about Better Angels, they had done those 2 workshops. They had a elementary website with a couple press clips and writings that had been put together around the theory and model. And I thought it was interesting. And so I started just kind of corresponding and volunteering, essentially, because I, at that time, was unemployed and had a lot of time. And I felt that I could bring value to the organization given my experience working on political campaigns and for clients doing communications and digital strategy and press. And I mean, the first sort of real experience that I had with Better Angels was our first bus tour, which is where we raised a little bit of money and we got on a bus for 3 weeks and went around the East Coast, mainly doing more workshops, recruiting some of our first volunteers, and planting the seeds for what would become Better Angels alliances. And I think I jumped at that opportunity because it was an adventure, right? I mean, get on a bus, go around the country doing this kind of crazy thing. Almost, felt like we were like a rock band or something. And it was successful. I think that the workshop itself was kind of lightning in a bottle, just because it was so different than the dominant form of cross-partisan engagement at the time, which was demonization, calling people out to the audience of people who already agree with you, etc.
So was that immediately resonant to you with your immersion in partisan politics? And
yeah, I mean, on the bus tour, I got to observe workshops and help lead a couple of them. And so I sort of witnessed firsthand the power of the work and the potential of it. So that was one piece of it. And then the second piece of it was just the people I was working with, the sort of initial nucleus of team members. And I think that's what really draws people in and keeps people engaged with Better, now Braver Angels, is the relationships and the trust and the joy and fulfillment that comes from working with people who share a mission and share a culture that is positive and humanizing and powerful, and then working with those same people to spread and export that culture. Because in some ways, the culture of Braver Angels is the very product that we are giving to the nation. So yeah, I think the bus tour is just becoming friends with people and feeling like we worked well together and feeling like it was a unique opportunity to help build something up from the ground up. And so that was the summer of 2017. And here we are 4 years later in the summer of 2021. And the organization has come a long way in terms of its growth and its reach and its activities.
Members, right?
Sorry?
Thousands of members now? Or?
Yes, thousands of members, over 1,000 active volunteers, almost 80 local alliances, new programs, debates, one-on-one conversations, and increasingly engagement with institutions, such as Congress. Earlier this summer, Bill was invited to testify to Congress, and we hope to begin to offer our programs to congressional staff and ideally to members of Congress themselves. So that's sort of the next big, I think, new arena of potential work.
One of the things I've run into when I talk about Braver Angels and the whole project with some of my friends who are mostly on the left is the issue of the priorities and time. And some of them will say, well, it's great, it's nice, it's good work to find common ground with people that are on the right, Trump supporters, and develop amicable relationships, and that's important. But climate change is real. Social inequality, economic inequality, the suffering of poor people, militarism, these things are real and life-threatening to people right now. And I need to put my time into that. I need to make the things happen that will help in those situations. And how do you, I mean, I hear you referring to Braver Angels, and I get it, that it's like a movement. And they would say, well, there is this movement to make the world better by bringing about these progressive changes, by addressing climate change, by all of that. So how do you respond to that? Or what's your own personal place in that?
Yeah, I think that everyone has a role to play and a lane, if you will. And I think that climate change is of utmost importance. And I think that choosing to spend one's time doing that is honorable and admirable and needed. It's needed. But so too is the work we're doing. And you don't always necessarily actively choose your lane or your contribution. Sometimes a series of choices and circumstances place you there, and then you understand that you're positioned to deliver value in this area. And I think the problem of political polarization is also a meta problem that's making it more difficult for us to make progress on climate change and inequality and any other host of issues. And there's not that many people who are directly working on political polarization. It's a fairly niche field. So I think a lot of these other areas are better staffed, so to speak. And so I think there's value in it. And I'll also say that it's not for everyone. It's a coalition of the willing and the enthusiastic. And obviously one only has a certain amount of hours in the day and a certain amount of time that one can put toward a project, particularly if you're volunteering. And it's, people prioritize things differently. And I I think a lot of people are drawn to Braver Angels, not just because of the work we do, but also because of the transformation that it can inspire in oneself in terms of feeling less animosity and less hopelessness, because ultimately those feelings are counterproductive in terms of making progress. Generally, I think that righteous anger certainly has a place, and anger and fear are powerful motivators. But when that anger and fear is directed toward millions of fellow citizens, it's generally counterproductive, I think, toward achieving policy goals, ideological goals, etc.
One of the things that I really appreciated that Braver Angels is doing is the workshops where you learn practices of speaking to your own allies, your own side, blue people talking to their blue allies, with learning the skills to teach ways of just communicating and relating and seeing people that are on the other side, so to speak, as human beings, and relate to them more respectfully, even for the purpose of achieving the goals that they have of whatever change they want to bring into the world. So I found that to be very, very valuable. What do they call that?
That I think that's part of depolarizing within.
Depolarizing within, right.
There's, part of it is looking within yourself to assess your own, inner polarizer, but part of it is also thinking about how you talk about the other side to people who already agree with you, because that's what really enforces the tribalism that underlies the rancor.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So just to switch to something else, when I initially contacted you, it was partly because of a video that I saw of a panel that you were on, in which you were asked a question, and then you, in the most relaxed and natural way, referred to an experience that you'd had with DMT, dimethyltryptamine, and you referred to plant medicines that are used by indigenous people, and how that can be a valuable way of learning more about yourself and about reality and the world. Can you say a little bit more about what your experiences have been with that? If it was a one-time thing with DMT, or if there's other ways that you've pursued that path?
Yeah, well, I think that one of the things that stands in the way of connecting with others or crossing boundaries or finding a certain transcendence or higher synthesis or connection with the divine is our own egos and our own sense of self and identity, which is increasingly informed by politics. And so I think that psychedelics, in addition to things like meditation, mindfulness, exercise, diet, they're all tools to help us reduce the ego to some extent and to get, closer to that feeling of transcendence, and that showing that reality is not always as set in stone as we might feel it to be. And so I think that certain mind altering substances, absolutely, LSD, psilocybin, DMT, mescaline, et cetera, are sort of like shortcuts to that. And I think when used in a thoughtful and intentional way can be very powerful and sort of healing and therapeutic. And I'm pleased to see that they're being increasingly accepted in mainstream culture. And there's a lot of emerging scientific research that explores the myriad benefits that psychedelics, as well as, empathogens like MDMA, can achieve in terms of helping people process trauma, achieve breakthroughs in relationships, and even, come to better terms or more accepting terms with our own insignificance or our own mortality. I know that they've given psilocybin to patients with terminal illness, and it's been to positive effects. And I think it's very powerful stuff, and it needs to be treated with care and structure, just like we do at Braver Angels. You can't just bring reds and blues in a room and ask them to debate immigration. And I think in the 60s, when people were just taking huge amounts of LSD, for example, I think it was pretty destructive. So
you've had,
yeah, I mean, go ahead.
Had experiences that have been in ritual settings or guided settings that have been influential in your life?
Yeah, I mean, ritualistic insofar as my, fellow psychonauts and I were creating the rituals. I would like to do a psychedelic experience with an experienced guide who has, sort of a well-developed and tested method for making the experience more impactful and more lasting. One of the problems too is you really have to kind of seek that out on your own. You can't just pull up an app on your phone and find your nearest shaman.
Michael Pollan, you're familiar with Michael Pollan's book and how that is really
How to Change Your Mind.
How to change your mind, and to some extent how to change the world, because minds are what creates the world, right? Yeah. So again, just in terms of yourself though, would you say they have influenced your own life in some way that you feel is positive? And
yes, absolutely. I think in terms of being able to access a broader perspective on one's life and the world, to get beyond the day-to-day, the sort of ego-centric mode of thinking about things, and also giving one access to the great reservoirs of joy and empathy and connection that we all have. It's quite extraordinary.
That brings me to another question. I don't know if you're familiar with Michael Lerner and Tikkun magazine and the movement that's called the Network of Spiritual Progressives. And he argues that for many decades, he's been arguing and writing books about the idea that the left has a reputation, not completely accurate, but somewhat well-deserved, that it's anti-religious, almost anti-spiritual. Maybe that comes out of the left's association with Marxism and that whole history. But he's really saying that that's what alienates so many people who gravitate toward the right, because they embrace religion, often fundamentalist religion, evangelical religion. But do you feel at all that like it would be a healthy thing to integrate spirituality with politics? And do you see Braver Angels in some way, even though they don't necessarily use that language, as kind of embodying a more spiritual approach to how it is we resolve the problems that we have?
Yes, 100%. I think that all human beings have sort of an innate desire for meaning and community. And for many people, religion provide that structure. And I think as society has become more secular and people have been repelled by organized religion that they feel is domineering and controlling and repressive, I think you see those desires being filled elsewhere. They're sort of new religions. And I think for a lot of people, politics has become a new religion because it's a community and it's a tribe and it's self-affirming, but it's so often oriented in terms of antagonism toward the other, which I think is very unhealthy.
As are many religions.
Right. And so I think if we can find ways to build a sort of a broader community of just human beings, I think that would be very positive for society. And I think that's what's at the root of our work, is just connecting as human beings who have disagreements, which is natural, and who have conflict, which is natural. But in sort of the Buddhist mindset, being able to observe the conflict without reacting to it in ways that are ultimately destructive. And I think that this quest for a higher sense of community and engagement across the vast richness and diversity of humanity is core to Braver Angels. I mean, the very notion of one's better angels is sort of the notion that God or a higher power resides within all of us. And it's not necessarily, grasping at angels in the sky, but trying to summon one's own better angels, famously invoked by Lincoln on the brink of the Civil War. And so I think from our very founding, that idea has been baked into our approach, from the name on down.
In that brief description you gave of your DMT experience, you actually referred to the idea that you had communed with beings that are in some way transcendent to or other than our earthbound creatures. And maybe you really were communing with angels there for a bit.
Yeah, angels or aliens, it's hard to say. I think that the DMT experience was very unique compared to other psychedelic experiences I've had. I'd say all the other
molecule. Have you heard that expression?
I have, yeah. I've seen the documentary, which is very interesting. I think with other psychedelic experiences I've had, I've existed in an altered state of reality, but still this reality. Whereas with DMT, I felt like I was in a completely new, an alien reality, and engaged with forces that were sort of outside of what had ever been previously experienced. And so it almost felt like a whole other realm that was very different from the human realm. And it's interesting because I think a lot of people who have smoked DMT or drunk ayahuasca or, you know, had a DMT experience report kind of similar feelings and experiences across time and cultures. So it's all very mysterious, but I do think that DMT in particular is kind of unique in that way. Yeah.
Well, it certainly sounds like you had an opening to the shamanic worldview, in which there are things at different levels of reality and whatever you want to call them or wherever they come from, that are significant and important and perhaps can be helpful in this effort that we're making to make this world a better place. So, yeah, again, I want to thank you for taking the time to have this conversation with me. Is there anything else you want to say that you want to, Braver Angels, or about yourself, or about the transition you've made from whatever you felt or was real before to the way you view reality now and life?
Sure. Well, I'd love to hear about your experiences, but I think that's for a separate conversation. But I would just encourage people to, you know, take that initial leap of faith, you know, even sign up for a one-on-one conversation and just notice the feelings that you have. You know, you feel your stomach clenching up and your fists start to clench and your blood start to boil. But do you also notice yourself liking the other person in spite of the crazy things or the harmful things that you hear them saying? And what do you make of that? And how could that be used to help oneself and others is an interesting query and an interesting exploration that can yield new and unexpected fruit.
Yeah, and I can testify to the fact that I have participated in some of that experience, and I as a long-time meditator, find it to be very helpful for psychological, spiritual growth, and I think also for the betterment of the world. So I really want to thank you for the work you're doing and taking the time to have this conversation. And so we'll say that's enough for now. Folks can pass this conversation along to others. Go to braverangels.org, and I'll be seeing you next time.